Welcome everyone to this week's edition of the Rising Tide Foundation lecture series, where we are finally walking into the 20th century in the fourth movement of our symposium on statecraft. So we've had the pleasure of listening to many presentations, tackle different cultures, the greatest thinkers of various times and different places who were able to leap outside of their circumstances and not only discover something about natural law, but transform and discover that insight into the political economic circumstances of their time that broke their societies from a tragic trajectory into something that was much more potential rich for the good. So Nicholas has given many presentations to us in the past. He's been a friend and a colleague now for quite some time. He is a dancer with La Grande Ballet de Montréal. He's toured around the world. And is also a president and founder of the Artists Alliance for Africa. There will be websites, so people listening on YouTube or on BitChute or wherever else we're going to be broadcast can go into the description box and check out those other projects, especially the Artists Alliance for Africa that Nick has been working on. Today, we will be pursuing the investigation of humankind's yearning for a new paradigm of brotherhood, of win-win cooperation, which is much more in tune and alignment with our true nature as a species of creative reason who looks to collaborate with our neighbors and to find common ground instead of just competing for diminishing returns of resources, which is a very British geopolitical, pessimistic, cynical way of thinking about our present or historical circumstances. The work on history, which is done by Nick and his studies of people like Cheikh Anta Diop, who was a great mind who we'll come to know today, of the Pan-African movement and the idea of not only an African Renaissance, but something which has a universal character, is something which we'll go through. And Nick, I don't want to say any more than that. I know you've got a lot that you've prepared, so I'm looking forward to this. It's all yours.
Too much. All right. Hello, everyone. So glad to have everyone here today. Thanks for turning up. I know it's a bit later than usual, so let's get started. I don't want to keep everyone too long, because I'll probably have to do a second class on this anyway, because it's just too much to condense. So now I'm going to share my screen. Here we have the dream of an African Renaissance, Cheikh Anta Diop's grand design. And just below here, I put a small little quotation. And this is, for me, like pretty much encapsulates Sheikh's vision for the future, which I don't know if we're going to have time to go into today, but like I say, we may do another class on it. But here's the quote: "Africa can and will only advance through the African integration, which can be realized through the federal United States of Africa." So, the basis for his dream. Cheikh, he was born in Tietou, Senegal, in 1923 in an aristocratic Muslim Wolof family, where he was raised under an Islamic education too. In 1964, at the age of 23, he obtained the colonial version of a baccalaureate before he moved to Paris, where he enrolled to study both maths and philosophy at the University of Paris. It's a Sorbonne university, if anybody who's wondering. It's really a prestigious university in the world. In 1948, he received his first degree in philosophy before going on to receive 2 diplomas in chemistry in 1950. In 1951, he meets Frédéric Joliot-Curie, Marie Curie's son-in-law. They worked together on nuclear physics until Frédéric's death in 1958. Diop went on to translate Einstein's theory of relativity into his native Wolof language. I find this really, it reminds me of Paul Robeson in the way that like he's so creative and fun about how he takes challenges on, like these, you know, these like kind of massive pillars of our scientific education, and he just takes it and translates it into his native language. I think that's, again, like it encapsulates the spirit of the man. Then in 1954, he completed his thesis, Who Were the Pre-Dynastic Egyptians? But sadly couldn't find a jury to examine his work for all sorts of reasons. Therefore, he published a work in his first book, Nation, Nègre et Courtier. So some of those reasons are, you know, the obvious ones. I mean, basically, people didn't want the rigorous research that he was doing. It didn't, you know, help certain people for it to be presented. And as up until that time, a lot of work had already been done. As we're going to see, I'm going to mention some of the names that he uses for his research. A lot of work had already been done, that's for sure. But well, yeah, a lot of work had been done, but he's collected all of this rigorous information, but they just basically didn't want to present it because it doesn't. At the time, you know, he's born in a time where Kennedy's alive, and I think the stakes were so high that the operations that were taking place in Europe and America at the time basically were made as in a way to stop such work being presented. He really did face significant difficulty in getting his work published. So more often than not, he would just take it and put it into a book because universities would not grade it. They wouldn't even judge it. So like I say, he couldn't find a jury to examine his work. I mean, that just goes to show, like, he wouldn't even look at it. His studies in Paris included history, Egyptology, physics, linguistics, anthropology, economics, and sociology. His main teacher being Gaston Bachelard, Frédéric Joliot-Curie, and André Leclerc-Gourhan. So again, we see the caliber of the man. He's studying everything and anything that he can. And I'd advise anybody to go watch an interview on YouTube with him after. You'll really see the intellect unveiled. It's quite impressive watching him talk. He normally has a translator with him as well, so you don't have to worry. He speaks in French, but he normally has an English translator with him. Then we're going to talk about some of his more political things. He becomes the editor of APAM, Association Populaire des Amis des Musées, with Madeleine Rousseau, a professor of art history, as a means of bringing culture to the masses. It's a magazine of sorts in Paris that they start. He doesn't start it, she already begins, and he comes in as an editor later on. And he discusses the essential topic, when we will be able to speak of an African Renaissance. He had examined a multitude of fields of artistic creation in languages, which he said would be the sources for African cultural regeneration. It was his idea that African culture was directly intertwined with ancient Egypt and suggested that their culture be rebuilt on this connection, much like the way European culture had been built on the legacies of ancient Greece and Rome. It is one of his most controversial claims that Egypt was in fact populated with black people, and that the pharaohs of Egypt are in fact largely of this race. Egyptian language and culture moved across to West Africa, and Diop used language, culture, and historical texts from such scholars as Ibn Battuta, Sabi, and Kati to conclude these claims. So to draw a little bit more from that, Cheikh does in this book, he does a little bit of work on Paleolithic, is that right? Basically man between 1 million and 10,000 years. And he shows that, I mean, you know, I think we all know that the history on early mankind is very, there's massive gaps in it, and we don't have all, you know, we don't have like the evidence to suggest such clear, you know, form. But he uses, you know, he's an extremely well-researched man. He uses an enormous amount of common sense to basically ascertain that in the beginning of times, like all people are born on the African continent, and he shows that actually all the people that are born there, all the different tribes, they're not all black. So, for example, Berber people who live in the north, they are not black people. They're actually white. And there are even tribes and clans in Ethiopia that are not what you would say are black. They're not black like Swahili black. And basically, through looking at this anthropology, looking at these different races, these different tribes, because that's actually what he's saying they are, right? Like he's like, they're not all of one race. And he says that white people are born out of a lighter skinned peoples off the African continent, like the Berbers, for example. And so he says that basically mankind is born in the Great Lakes region of East Africa, and it's from here that they start to shift northwards, basically following the River Nile, which makes perfect sense. And then after, of course, following the Nile naturally because of their reliance on the water, and of course having the Sahara as a natural partition between East and West, and even North and South too. He says first people went to Egypt up the Nile naturally because it was just naturally easier to do so. But then as their culture and their their knowledge expanded of the world around them, these people and the tribes that were not necessarily, they didn't all move up to Egypt, but from that movement, that north-south migration that was happening, it started to basically stretch out between East and West more and more. And because there was more room to go towards the West, basically it was considered that there would be more riches and wealth over there, so that people generally moved towards the West, given that the Nile was already on the east side of Africa, so it just naturally sensibly made sense to go to that side, given that that was uncharted territory. Much the same in how the Europeans went to the Americas to find a new world, uncharted territory. People are generally excited by things that haven't been seen yet.
So Cheikh was not just an academic, but also very political. In fact, he went on to become General Secretary of the student sector of the political party Rassemblement Démocratique Africain. One of their slogans was national independence from the Sahara to the Cape and from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic. The movement focused itself on Diop's research and wanted to use this education to restore African national consciousness that they argued had been totally distorted by the period of slavery and colonialism. Diop took up the call to rebuild the African personality from a strictly scientific socio-historic perspective. He warned, it was particularly necessary to avoid the pitfall of facility. It could seem too tempting to delude the masses engaged in a struggle for national independence by taking liberties with scientific truth, by unveiling a mythical, embellished past. Those who have followed us in our efforts for more than 20 years know now that this was not the case and that this fear remained unfounded. He goes on, the most brilliant pseudo-revolutionary eloquence that ignores the need for rebuilding the African national consciousness, which must be met if our people are to be reborn culturally and politically. He would go on to found more political parties, Bloc des Masses Sénégalaises and Front National Senegalese being most important. I'm going to talk a little bit here about those. The first party, he also singled out the contradiction of the African historian who evades the problem of Egypt. He really sticks to the point that a lot of Western historians and previous African historians, they kind of whitewash the whole Egyptian history. And they Hollywood's done it as well, and everyone's aware of like Elizabeth Taylor's reenactment of Cleopatra and things like this that centrally nice and like they're nice on the surface of it, but actually there's a deeper message being put forward, and it's one of like it really is not culturally appropriate, and it is a bastardization of history, and it does definitely distort people's consciousness about different cultures. So like, if, you know, I'm pretty sure that those movies were done to distort the consciousness of people and their perception of Africa. Whenever I was taught about Egypt in school, there was never any discussion of it being even an African country. I mean, like, people really almost like to pretend like Egypt is something in and of itself and not really part of the continent. And I've always felt that, like, you know, structurally in school, that was kind of trying to be put on, but without anything really backing it up. And that's what Sheikh's saying. Like, he's like, there's actually so much evidence and literature out there to suggest, and not just suggest, but like clearly make a link between what is happening in ancient Egypt and what is actually the predetermining factor for the arrival of these empires in the West. For example, the language of Wolof, which is in Senegal, which is the language of Cheikh Anta Diop, it's his fluent native language, has exact hieroglyphs the same as in Egyptian and have the same meaning too. So it's incredible to think, and what he says is like, you cannot detach that fact from the time. You have to assume that those people have literally taken that language across Africa, and that he found it extremely interesting that it's the people who went the furthest to the West that are actually the most, in terms linguistically, are most direct to the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, like the ancient Egyptian. So that's something really interesting to be looked at. And for example, in this book, he touches on it. Most of the chapters in this book are quite short and dense. He goes into it more on another book, which I'm just going to grab, which I actually haven't begun yet. And this is why we're going to have to do a second class. It's this one here. And it's thicker, and he goes into more, just generally gives you a bit more sense and more content. A lot of this book is about form and the organization and the political structure of Africa, the societal customs, how trade took place and things like that. And those things we're going to look at today. Now to talk about the politics a bit. The first party, Le Bloc des Masses Senegalaises, was formed in 1961. And by 1962, Diop's party were working on the ideas put forward in his Black Africa, the economic and cultural basis for a federated state, this book. So this was basically the book that founded his first political party. And it's these, he was basing his political party off these ideas. So this goes back to, this book is basically that first quote that we spoke about, the Federal United States of Africa. This in here is basically all of that. So, and this party, BMS, becomes a serious threat to the regime of the then president Leopold Senghor, who was not the kindest president. Diop was then arrested and thrown into jail for political reasons. He nearly died in jail, actually, from sickness. And after this whole debacle, it was very chaotic, a lot of violence. The party could not continue effectively. It got disbanded, and it was too violent to continue its operation, like to continue what it was doing socially. They were very afraid of the education he was trying to bring about. So Black Africa, the economic and cultural basis for a federated state, is the book Diop wrote to best state his political aims and objectives. In it, he argues that only a united and federated African state will be able to overcome underdevelopment. He comes back to his research on the universality of the underdevelopment of Africa witnessed physically. He comes back to his research on the universality of African linguistics and using them for the foundation of an African Renaissance. He considers that the underdevelopment of Africa witnessed physically is in fact directly linked to the lack of development in the culture and the study of its origins also. This critical work constitutes a rational study of not only Africa's cultural, historic, and geographic unity, but of Africa's potential for energy development and industrialization. These things, again, I don't have time to go into today, but in that book, like, what we find is Africa has pretty much a monopoly over most rare earth minerals in the world. And it's just the base fact. Like, for example, when Congo was colonized by Belgium, a large amount, there's a famous mine in the south of Congo there. I can quickly find that, I think. But there's a mine, and basically it's a uranium mine. And back in the 60s, when nuclear was all the rave, was having kind of, I mean, of course, there's always been an operation against nuclear, but was having its heyday, especially under the American government at the time that was pushing it forward. You know, countries like France as well, that were heavily developing nuclear power in their own country at that time, came in need of uranium. Now, Europe doesn't have much. And so what Belgium did is they basically ransacked this mine in the Congo of all of what he says around 70% of its uranium. And this has been going on for centuries. Like, Africa has basically been looted of its raw materials for a long time, and still there is so much left. So in this book he gives clear percentages, like specific numbers. There's a man who he keeps on referencing called the Zhonghe. I can put the name in the chat after, but he's basically the guy who he's getting all his numbers from on basically all the resources under the ground. So moving on, after the BMS.
This mine is the Katanga mine, about 100 kilometers from Lubumbashi.
Thank you, John, for the reference. So in this book here, it's called Desire River Basin. So he does a small chapter on it, and he goes into the enormous amount of wealth that they have in the ground now. I'm just looking. Have you heard of the Shink-Rolobwe mines, John? John?
I think that's the official name of the place.
That's the official name of it. Okay, right. So we have the same place.
Société Minière du Katanga was the name of the company.
Okay, yeah, same name. So he reckons here it says this mine is rich in zinc, lead, silver, industrial diamonds, gold, and uranium, of which the uranium, they reckon around 60 to 70% of it was actually already mined and taken by the Belgians and sold to to the European countries that needed it to develop their nuclear power. So yeah, I mean, stolen goods basically. So to move on, after the BMS, his first political party was dissolved. Diop and other former members reconstituted themselves under a new party, the Front National Senegalese, in 1963. Under significant political pressure, President Senghor attempted to appease Diop by offering him and his supporters a certain number of government positions. Now, for most people that would work, but for Diop, not. He completely refused to enter into any negotiations until two conditions were met. First, that all political prisoners be released, and secondly, that discussions be opened on government ideas and programs, not on distribution of government posts. Now that's amazing. Like that's really, again, testament of his character. He's saying like the political negotiation should be around policy and not around bribery. Like you're not going to use bribery to basically get me to give up on my principles. Like he's way too much of an educated man to and he's written all these books. So, they completely underestimate him, but he refuses. And in protest, in protest at this, the administration didn't release any political prisoners. They kept them all there. And Diop remained largely absent from the political scene from 1966 onwards to his death. So politically, a very torrid time, didn't necessarily achieve much in terms of moving the country forward, which is a great shame, because if anybody could have done it for West Africa, if he had become president, I mean, who knows what could have been. But there we have it. That's pretty much his character in the shortest terms I could put it. So Matt, if you could go to the next slide. So these are some of the questions I want to kind of look at today. On what basis do we suppose Diop has come to his conclusion on Black African history and its unity with Egyptian history? I've spoken a little bit about it, but we're going to look at architecture, as we can see here, and some other things. These two photos show a Nubian temple on the left and a Ghanaian mosque on the right. What similarities do we gather centrally? I'll look at some more of these examples later, and we'll talk about it. Is it even reasonable to consider that ancient Egypt and Black Africa could not be historically and culturally of the same origin? Sheikh claims that true African independence is impossible without the correct historical and cultural conscience in the population. What are the fundamental reasons for this conclusion? And lastly, Sheikh spent his life researching and studying the very depths of African history, culture, linguistics, and anthropology in the widest possible means. What can we draw from his final work on a federal United Nations of Africa? How has his life's work led to this realization? That question we may not get to. So next slide, please, Matt. These are just general things I want people to think about as we move through. So here we have this map I was saying about. This was drawn up by a Spanish cartographer who, forgive me, I've now forgotten the name. I can find it for you later and put it in the chat box. I've had so many names. Yeah. Anyway, at the top here, we have Al-Bakri, Ibn Battuta, Ibn Khaldun, Fustel du Coulange, the Tariq al-Sudan from Abid al-Sadi, and the Tariq al-Fatash, written by Mahmoud Kati. These are the essential sources on the history of Africa, and basically these are all the names that Sheikh has presented to me in this book and to his audience. These are the Tariq al-Sudan and the Tariq al-Fatash essentially are two documents that were written, and they lay out all the customs, and they have stories and tales of the kings and their conquests, and many details on how life was in these three empires. So the Empire of Ghana, I think I corrected it on your version. No, it's corrected back. So actually, the start date for the Empire of Ghana is a little bit hazy. I've seen conflicting information. Sheikh claims it's around 0 BC, like well, right on the turn of the millennium. But I've seen anything from 300 BC, 300 AD to 600 AD. So, but Sheikh is saying that around the turn of the millennium, the Empire of Ghana, or at least the beginning of that kind of unity, starts to come about, starts to manifest. So we have the Empire of Ghana first. Again, that re-edited itself, maybe because I sent Matt the old version, but it comes to an end under the siege from Sundiata Keita, who is the beginning of the Empire of Mali. But before him, there are a succession of kings. Most of them are called Sise. And to be honest, there's from what Sheikh has told me, there's not much information that can be gathered on any of those kings specifically. All that we have from the Empire of Ghana is like customs, the role of women in society, and so on, like trading, what kind of materials they were using, things like this. So later on, as we go through the form here and we get more to content later on, we're going to look at some texts which we're going to read, and we'll see what that's like. So the Empire of Ghana merges into the Empire of Mali, where this king, Sundiata Keita, who is a Malian, he is the first king of the Empire of Mali, and he merges the two together. So he conquers Ghana after Ghana has basically gone through a period in the 1000 to 1100 AD period, where the Almoravids from Spain and Morocco, the Ghanaian empire is starting to wane, and its boundaries are starting to wane, and they're losing control over the fringes of its empire. And the Almoravids attack this. They see the trade routes that are happening across the Sahara, and they want to basically take control of them. They much like how the Romans wanted to take control of the Silk Road trade routes, or some emperors did. So there's always, whenever people see wealth, there's this, natural wish to conquest things and to bring them under our control. And so the Almoravids do this. They take over Ghana for 10 years. There's enormous amounts of poverty. They loot the kingdom of Ghana. They take all of its wealth. The people are left impoverished. And due to that, the people rise up in a short amount of time and they overthrow the Almoravids, and they're sent back from whence they came. And it's at this period that you have a kind of uncertain time that Sundiata Keita, basically there's another tribe called the Soso who start attacking the Empire of Ghana. And Sundiata Keita sees this and he's like, this is a nightmare waiting to happen. I'm going to basically merge all of this into one and restore order. So he sees that the Empire of Ghana is falling apart. He sees it's being attacked from the outside, and he's like, okay, let's reunify. So he, being a brilliant strategist, he's considered by Cheikh Anta Diop as he doesn't say philosopher king, but he says one of the greatest kings to ever walk the plains of Africa. And this man reigns for around 30 years. He's, as I wrote here, is considered one of the greatest empire builders in all of Africa. And he basically doubles the size of the Empire of Ghana into what is the Empire of Mali. We're going to see it in the next slide. Then after Sundiata Keita has founded the Empire of Mali, we have Muhammad ibn Ku. Now, this is the story that John mentioned earlier about West Africans voyaging across the Atlantic Ocean to visit the New World, the Americas. Now, this is the king that does it. Later on, I'll show you the content where it's actually written, but he sets out, his reign is only 5 years. The reason for that is because this king, he is so courageous. He, in, I think, 1310 or so, he sends out 200 ships, they say, to the Atlantic to see if they could discover anything. And out of those 200, only one returns. And he tells the king of what he saw, that there are other lands, and but he also tells him that the seas are treacherous and that it's extremely dangerous, and he doesn't think so many of the ships made it. There were storms, there were problems. But we can ascertain that given the stories he returns to the king, there's definitive proof that they reach land. At this point, it's still unsure which land, as there are islands. They could have reached the Cape Verde, but it's, from what Sheikh's saying, they're already aware that those islands exist there because, like of other voyages, they already have boats that can carry 80 people in the Empire of Ghana and Mali. So they're already building ships that are capable of traversing ocean water, not just rivers. But then it gets more interesting. So this king, he actually, when that one ship comes back, he rescinds his claim to the throne. He steps down. He hands the throne over to his most trusted. Is it or no? No, in this case, it's the daughter. It's the son of his sister, and this is something we're going to go into later as well. Because the lineage of kings, kings in these African empires, is basically, it's not from the king's offspring. They say that this offspring cannot be securely of the king's blood, for there is the potential of, adultery. So basically, they take the offspring from the sister of the king, where they can absolutely, without any, sliver of a doubt, they can absolutely be sure that the bloodline is still of that family. So it's one of the very interesting things that I learned, that it's very different to European feudalism, where all the kings or queens are coming from a direct lineage of that former king. Whereas in Africa, it's not like that. It's not your sons and daughters are not going to become king or queens. It's your sister's sons and daughters that have the chance of becoming queen or king, which is interesting because then you don't have these not so much these inter-family battles where sons are usurping their fathers and things like that. It's somehow The families seem to be bigger as well. There's a huge population, something else that we're going to talk about, because it links up very much with what Lyndon LaRouche discovered in the past few decades with his population relative density and so on and so forth. So yeah, so then he hands he leaves on a second voyage with this time 2,000 ships, and he never comes back. So and then we have to go to Columbus, and we're going to look at some text from Columbus later, where it does talk about him witnessing and encountering Black peoples in the Americas. And he actually talks about their customs even there. And I think at one point he does say that they are generally more peaceful than the Reds, what he calls the Reds at the time, and is given a better welcome from the Blacks than the Reds. And these Blacks living in Americas are still continuing cultural traditions from Africa. So if we link these two things together, we can be pretty sure that those Black people in America are of that voyage of that king, Muhammad ibn Ku, who traveled with 2,000 ships from the west of Africa all the way across to the Caribbean and South America. So then when he leaves, he passes over his reign to he who is known as Mansa Musa. Now, Mansa Musa is probably the out and out most famous king of all the three empires. He is known as far away as China, and he is the man at the bottom of that image there. So the man sat on that red cushioned golden throne with the golden orb and staff in his hands is Mansa Musa, and this was drawn up by a Spanish cartographer. It's actually in the Catalan Atlas. It could be found online. And here you have a description of, trade routes, the different cities, and so on. So it's a kind of an illustrative map of what is taking place. I think those names along the coast there are literally of all the cities that are popping up. But Mansa Musa, he's a brilliant king. He from the stories that were written about him, he's so loved by the people that like whenever he comes to a city, he's paraded, like people come out and they witness him. But also whenever he visits a city that he hasn't been to before, it's said that he built both a mosque and a library or a university of sorts. Whenever he went to a new city and saw that a mosque and a library wasn't there, those are the two things that he helped build. He would give his wealth and his manpower, of which he had many slaves, to build these big, enormous teaching centers. That's why we have people from Spain, from the Arab world, from Syria, coming to Timbuktu and Gao, which is the capital of the Songhai Empire, which we're going to look at after this. They're coming to these two major commercial centers to study and to learn. And also Black Africans are going to Spain, and there are stories of, people studying alchemy and theology and, all sorts of studies. They are also going to the Spanish universities in Granada, in Sevilla, in Marbella. Ibn Battuta actually says in one of his texts, like he meets Black people in Sevilla in the university there, and they go back to sub-Saharan Africa to bring that knowledge back. So there is a very dynamic kind of what I thought was a two-way dialogue of cultures between Islamic and the Islamic Renaissance and the Golden Renaissance in Europe, one which is Christian, the other is Islamic. But it's also happening in Africa, right? And by this point, bear in mind, the Empire of Ghana is not so much. There are elements of Islam, but by now, Empire of Mali is a fully Islamized empire, and it's under Mansa Musa that basically that happens. It's used to unify people, and actually they use the Quran as the teaching scripture to basically teach people how to read, write, and so on and so forth. So it's said that in those days that most young people could recite the Quran by heart. I find that incredible. Most of the students that are going through the schools there, they're being taught to recite the text by heart, and they use them in their other studies as well and translate it into principles that they can use in their studies of other subjects, technology, science, and so on and so forth. Now, that it doesn't have the same rigor as what we saw in Europe with the Golden Renaissance and the explosion of scientific exploration and discoveries that happened, but there are elements of it for sure. And we're going to look at some pictures later of certain Africans looking through a sort of telescope. Then you have the Songhai Empire. Sunni Ali is the first reigning king of the Songhai Empire. Again, a brilliant king, reigns for 25 years. And the Songhai merges what was the Empire of Mali and the Empire of Ghana now into an even bigger empire, which basically expands across the entire West African region, from what you would say today is like Chad, Lake Chad, to, well, the now depleted Lake Chad, to the Atlantic Ocean, the Senegal, the Gambia. So huge, right? Like this area is almost, I think, twice the size of Europe. So a huge expanse. And by the way, also 400, Sheikh is saying roughly between 300 and 400 million people living there, which I find absolutely, like, at the same time in Europe, you have around 90 million people. So, and that's a very natural consequence. Africa has a lot more natural prosperity in the ground. It's much easier, judging from what Sheikh's saying, like it's much easier to live there because, for example, gold is so plentiful in Africa that they even adorned their slaves in gold. So slaves are in Africa treated way better than in Europe. They are normally, they are entitled to some form of personal wealth. They wear gold, they have jewelry. They, especially in the women's part of the family, like under the woman's household, the slaves that she owns, they are almost a part of the family actually, because they are the teachers of the children. They're going to be doing the homework with them. They're also cooking in the kitchen. So there had to be an enormous amount of trust. It wasn't so much servitude, it is more bondage. And it's kind of almost win-win in a way, because the slaves, it's not that they are not receiving any goodness from this relationship. It is very much a business, like still the same kind of general form, but the content, what's happening, the way it is exhibited in reality is of a far different perspective to what you have in Europe, where it's far more barbaric, and we all know well about that and the history of that. So when we can assume that when the Africans, just to touch on this now, we're going to touch on it more later, but when the Africans started selling their slaves, which by the way, they were selling them because there could be no way that we could have conquered Africa at this time. We simply did not have the firepower to do so. As we saw, the Moroccans did try, they failed multiple times. And they had arms while the Africans were fighting with spears, and the Africans still beat them. So, and I'm going to go into, like, this again later on, we'll talk about some of these things, but we have some text to show the size of these armies. We're talking 40, 50,000 infantrymen for the Songhai Empire. So Sunni Ali, his reign ends in 1492. His son comes in called Sani Baru. He will not convert to Islam. That's considered a problem for most people by then. And he is killed in battle by Sunni Ali's very much respected military general. And because the son who is coming in, Sani Baru, will not convert to Islam, Muhammad, this general, challenges him to, well, first tries to convince him to become Islamized. Before starting a fight, he does the Askir Muhammad, who's trying to usurp this son. He does send him many letters, like, please, bow down to the religion of Islam. Please give yourself to this moral life, and writes him a very nice letter trying to convince him to come onto the side of Islam. He's not been a very good son even to his father. He basically, while his father is ruling a kingdom and taking care of it and building lots of architecture and basically doing what philosopher kings do, his son is completely the opposite, as we found a lot of times in Rome. Sons often turned out to be not like their fathers, and this one's very much the same. He's in the capital having way too much fun. He's not interested in traveling. He doesn't want to see the world. He's just doing all the things that we know most people like that do. And so when it comes to military strategy, he has no idea what he's doing. And they eventually go to battle after the generals tried to convince him to do what's right, or what the society considers is right. He won't do it. And so they go to battle. The Askir Muhammad wins. And he becomes king, and he goes on to reign for another 35 years. So the Askir Muhammad the Great, he's also, him and Mansa Musa, these three empires. Next slide, please, Matt. God, that was a long one. So here we have a map, and on the right, this will give you an idea of the form. You have the purple area on the right, that's all of Africa that became Islamized. So Islam very much stayed in the north and came down on the east side. And I've been to Kenya and Tanzania, I've actually witnessed the architecture there in places like Zanzibar. It's all Islamic. It's very beautiful. It's very elaborate. And in the purple there, you see the green of Ghana, the kind of browny grayish of Mali, with Timbuktu in the middle there. And on the eastern side, you have the Songhai. So to be clear, you can consider that Ghana's like the beginning. It's not that they're distinct from one another. So Ghana's the beginning. Mali takes Ghana and unifies it into Mali. And Songhai in the orange takes them both, Mali and Ghana, and unifies them into the Songhai Empire. Yeah. So it's pretty much like where they've shown in yellow on the left side of Ghana there, that's also Songhai Empire territory later on. Like the Wolof state on the very, very end there, that's also part of Songhai. Eventually, all of those tribes, Wolof in Benin, where we see examples of classical sculpture and art going on, again, unified into Songhai Empire. Basically, all of those tribes, which are all of different origins, or at least have different ethnicities, different skin colors, different languages. There's so many languages on the African continent. It's unparalleled, I would say, in other parts of the world. I think we're talking over 2,000 different languages. And on the left here, I'm afraid it's in Spanish. It's the only one I can find, but that's the tribes. Some of them, that's actually not all of them. Even within these states, you have even smaller subcategories of these tribes. And there are a few missing from here as well. Or maybe it's just because it's in Spanish that it's a different translation. But yeah, that gives you an example of all the different, and really they all have like distinct cultures. And I can't go into it now because it's just way too much to really do a 2-hour class on. I could do a 2-hour class on the cultures alone. Like if I just took Benin classical artwork alone, we could do a class on that. Like, and I'm going to show you a picture just to give you some content, but yeah, there's a lot. Actually, Benin right now is asking for like 10,000 artifacts back from France. So yeah, like maybe we'll see those one day. But so yeah, that's the form. You can see there, those are the different empires, and within the empires on the left side, those are the different tribes that you have, but they all end up being unified as one West African empire that comes under Askir Muhammad, under the Songhai Empire, right at the end of the 1400s, just as Europe's coming into its golden renaissance. And there you have it. That's pretty much like the Songhai is the final empire. After that, we have a period of disintegration. Colonialism begins, and we'll talk about the loss of population and how that directly affected the economic wealth of the population in Africa, given that they lost all their men first. So next slide, please, Matt. So here we have two pictures. On the top is the Larabanga Mosque. There's a mosque built in the Sudanese architectural style. It's Nubian architecture, but it's in the village of Ghana, this mosque. This is not Like this mosque is old, but it has been retouched. The people there, they retouch it, they renovate it, as we say. So it's not it hasn't been standing like that for 2,000 years. Like it has had touches. And also the one below it, it's still standing today. This one below, it's in it's the Great Mosque of Djenné in Mali. You can go on Google Images and see it. Like people still add to it today. They still, again, they renovate it. They keep it standing. They're very proud of it. It was built towards the end of the 13th century. Again, it's not exactly clear. There's no, from what they know, there's no dates on the building itself. There's no way from now. There's no way of knowing of when it was actually built, but I guess they've done some form of forensics on it, and they say around the end of the 13th century. This is in the period of Mansa Musa's great reign. So this would have been one of the mosques that we're talking about. I said whenever he entered the city, he built a mosque. This is the one he built in Djenné. Now, Djenné is not even the biggest city of this empire. Timbuktu is. So I'll show you Timbuktu's one later on. It's very similar, yeah. So Matt, you can go to the next slide. So now I'm going to look at some content with everyone. This is an excerpt on the Empire of Ghana. And this is touching on the issue of slavery. I'm going to read it because I want to blast through this. So here goes. The Empire of Ghana, according to Bakri, was defended by 200,000 warriors. So this is the Empire of Ghana, the very first one. 40,000 of these warriors were archers. Its power and reputation, renowned as far as Baghdad in the east, were no mere legend. It was actually a phenomenon attested to by the fact that for 1,250 years, a succession of black emperors occupied the throne of a country as vast as all of Europe, with no enemy from without, nor any internal tensions able to dismember it. The capital was already a cosmopolitan and international city. It had its own Arab quarter where Islam existed alongside the traditional cult before the conversion of the royal dynasty and the people. In Bakri's time, the city already boasted a dozen mosques located in the Arab sector, with their imam, muezzins, and salaried lectors. It had a large number of jurists and scholars. 10,000 meals cooked over 1,000 bundles of wood were served daily. The emperor himself attended these feasts, to which he treated the populace outside his palace. Some king, he feeded 10,000 people. The empire first opened itself to the world at large through commerce. It already enjoyed international repute, which would be inherited and extended by the future empires of Mali and Songhai. But domestic slavery at this time was rife in African society. One could sell his fellow man to another citizen or a foreigner, which explains why Berber and Arab merchants, grown rich since settling at Awudagast, though still vassals of the black sovereign, could acquire black slaves on the open market. Some individuals in this city owned as many as 1,000 slaves. This shows the peaceful means by which the white world could possess black slaves. It was not through conquest, as has often been asserted. These empires, defended when necessary by hundreds of thousands of warriors and having their centralized political and administrative organization, were much too powerful for a single traveler thousands of miles away from home to try any sort of violence against them. The reality of the matter was much simpler, as evidenced by the proceeding. For reasons to be explained later on, slavery would cease to exist in the white world, especially Europe, while still subsisting in the black. One sees here the complex facts that it has often been very tempting to use so as to obscure certain points of history. All the white minorities living in Africa might own black slaves, but slaves and white masters alike were all subjects of a black emperor. They were all under the same African political power. No historian worth his salt can permit the obscuring of this politico-social context, so that only the one fact of black slavery emerges from it. So this is something I was talking about earlier, and this is something I think at the end we're going to talk a lot about, like the just general subject of slavery. I think, especially in white minds, but pretty much it's a world problem. It's been distorted to the point of that basically only white people ever had slaves. Now, because most people, and of course, anybody who's read a book on history will know that that's basically not true, because anybody, well, I mean, already with the Romans, we know that the slaves, the original word slave comes from the word Slav, which is Slavic people, which were taken from the northern part of Europe and were used by the Roman Empire to be slaves. So it was white people being used, white people were using white people to be slaves. And we saw that, you actually even saw that in Britain, like Oliver Twist, right? Charles Dickens shows us a very distinct and literal description of London in that time, using children, white children, taken from rich families, abducted, almost kidnapped, to be put in workhouses, like sweeping chimneys and all sorts of things. So that's just, it's really not a color thing. It's really not a race thing. Actually, it's just a general idea of mankind. And these oligarchs, these people who run these empires, they consider that, it's all fair game. Doesn't matter what color you are. They just use those things as like dividing factors, but it's not, for them, it's not about that. They just consider that all human beings are beasts. And so their value is basically the body that they sit in, and how can we best use that body to extort them and get whatever riches we can out of them. But in Africa, something that I'd like to say, slaves are not treated like this, as we already mentioned. So the slaves on the man's side are generally won through conquest, through conquering other lands. But even then, they become part of the military. They're often, they're given armor, swords. They're taught how to fight. They're endowed with certain skills, right? So there's a element of how do you say, inclusivity, like, or there's a more accurate word, but when you basically bring someone in to your circle, rather than bringing them in and still keeping them on the outside of society, which is very barbaric. What the Africans are doing, even with their slaves, they're very much part of society. They're actually, society, you could say, is pretty much dependent on them. They're the ones that are farming. And also in their caste system, the way it works in Africa at this time is that each person, each family, once the tribe had been given a caste, like a job, that was it. Like, you were stuck in that job, right? So like, regardless of whether you were slave, merchantman, whatever you were, like, your family name derided what skill set you were pushed to work on. So like, doctors all came from the same family, and like different families had doctors specifying in different realms of the science. So one family would be a doctor of herbology, for example, and maybe gastro problems. And so that family would then, life or death, whatever would happen, regardless of time, regardless of space, they would continue to practice that, and their son would practice it, and his son would practice it, and his daughter would practice it. And it was a caste system like that. They were put into these kind of categories, and then the family name became the blacksmith for all time. This is also the reason why the Ghanaian Empire and its lineage goes without much chaos and manages to have, as he said, 1,250 years of succession of black emperors occupy the throne of a country as vast as all of Europe. The reason it could do this was because of this caste system as well. It brings about an enormous amount of order, and as we know that already, prosperity was not a problem because Africa is so rich resource-wise. It just generally never came about for the people to have a revolution. And Sheikh talks about that like in a bit more depth, but the natural circumstances never arose, that the people never found a struggle inside of their daily life big enough to take on the structures of power above them. It also seems that they have pretty good kings. And again, not all of them are good. I've looked at some bad ones too, but I'm not going to spend any time on those today because we just don't have time. So next slide. Oh, damn it. Well, there we have it. Yeah, sorry, Matt, you got the unfinished version somehow. But anyway, here are 3 pictures, and I'm just going to explain them to you. So on the bottom right is Kumbi Saleh. This was the former capital of Ghana. It still lies there today. It's a ruin. That castle in the middle, for all intent, like from what I can gather, from what I've read, is the official residence of the king of the day, because they say he lives in a castle, a tower in the middle of the city. The walls around this castle are the city, what's left of the city today. And different historians and archaeologists claim that the actual castle there standing in the middle was the king's residence, and he could see out over the city whenever he wished and see what needed to be done or where people were suffering, and could attend to their needs as and when was needed. On the top there is the Great Mosque of Djenné. I showed you another picture of that before from a different angle. It's nice to see different angles of these buildings. They're just stunning, and you see different characters in them. And then also on the bottom left there is actually the mosque in Timbuktu. So very similar to the one in Djenné, almost identical, but of a different, in a different place. You can go to the next slide, please.
Okay, just quick question. What are those protrusions coming out of the buildings?
They are towers. They're not
the horizontal protrusions
horizontal.
coming out of the walls.
That's wood, and again, it's for structural reasons. It's because it's made out of mud, and that wood as the building gets higher, they need to use the wood to stabilize the mud, for something to the mud to bind onto, because at the higher levels, as the wind is more intense, the mud just would not stay together unless they had a kind of stabilizing structure and something for the mud to bind to. It's a mixture of mud and excrement and other things, but mostly mud and clay.
Okay.
So then we have two pictures of, and again, I'm really sorry, guys, you have received the almost finished version, but I can fill in the gaps. The caravan of Mansa Musa extended as far as the eye could see, and it is said that the Empire of Mali took a whole year to cross. We know from Ibn Battuta that it took at least 4 months to travel between Aoudagast, northern Malian border. That city, Aoudagast, is on the northern Malian border, and Niani, which is in the south of today. I think it's today's Ghana. I may have to check that. But these pictures are of Mansa Musa. So he's the king of the Malian Empire, the first philosopher king that I spoke about. And it's known that he, instead of sailing westwards into the seas, he considered it would be a good idea to go back across the desert to Egypt. And the reason he wanted to do this was because the sheikh in Egypt at the time was considered like the Pope of the Muslim world. And Mansa Musa at that time wanted to make the Empire of Mali to Islamize the Empire of Mali. So the way he did this was he took an enormous caravan, as you can see in that caricature drawing there, but also on the bottom is a more historical illustration of it. And again, I don't know who did it. I couldn't find the illustrator, but there you have it. Gives you a pretty, big example. Like the caravan stretches all the way over the hill there, so it's huge, and it's said that anywhere between 20 and 30,000 people went on with him on this caravan, not just over 1,000 camels. I mean, we're talking numbers that are just like, what on earth? And it's that map as well by that Spanish cartographer, which shows us the stature of this man, like the story of this man reaches us. There are scripts in China with Mansa Musa's name on it, so he's really famous in the world at this time. It's not just that people in Africa know him. Like, he's known in Sevilla, he's known in China, he's known in Baghdad. Like, he's showing up everywhere. People are talking about how much gold he has, how much prosperity the people have there, how whenever they come into contact with Black Africa, they just find that there's so much wealth, there's so much of everything. When the merchants are coming to the frontier, there's this city in the north of the desert called Tegetsa. It's where this empire is mining all of its salt. It's not a very nice city, but of course it's a satellite city. But merchants are coming there from the outside, and they're trading with, you know, Black African merchants that are coming to the frontier to trade with them. And they're just, you know, the merchants from Spain and other places like Egypt and Syria, and even as far as like Samarkand and like over there, like which is now today's Pakistan, I think, or Afghanistan. They're coming from all the way over there. So really expansive, the way that these stories stretch out. In the bottom there, I've put 60,000 of which 12,000 are slaves, all of which are cloaked in Persian silk and brocade. That's the slaves. Right, the other 48,000 men were dressed in even nicer things, but the slaves even are dressed in gold, like bronze brocades, like that go around the wrist, and Persian silk. 500 slaves followed the king on his horse, each with a gold-adorned staff. Right, like 500 slaves, each with a gold-adorned staff. I mean, it's like this is wealth, and 80 camels each with 300 pounds of gold. So whoever wants can do the math and figure it out. But yeah, it is said that when he left Egypt, he devalued the price of gold so much that it took 12 years or 10 to 12 years for the Egyptian economy to recover. So that's just a direct quote from a merchant that said this. It's written in, I think, Ibn Battuta's recollections of his travels, which we're going to look at in a bit. No, I said it all right. Yes. Okay. By the way, yes, something I forgot to miss in the previous slide. Timbuktu was home to one of the world's largest libraries and has students in its universities from literally all over the world, bar the Americas. He compares the library in Timbuktu to the one in Alexandria. He actually says, this is where it gets super cool, there are scriptures and texts in the library in Timbuktu that are originals from the Library of Alexandria. And he's encouraging researchers and historians to continue looking for it, because he said, like, in that library in Timbuktu, it's still there. With working with people who know how to handle these very, very old texts, having been in there, he's like, oh my God, it's the first thing that people have got to do, because he focuses mostly on West Africa, but he said, like, yeah, someone's got to do it for East Africa. They've also got to do it for the Zulu and the Tutsi tribes in South Africa and stuff like this. Like, and it's not just those, there's like so many, like, and he's like, each corner of Africa we must go through the same rigorous research that I have done over my lifetime for each, like Northeast, South, and West. And it's because there are in Africa these libraries that they still have some of the world's oldest texts known to man, and they're kept there. It's just that it's very expensive work. You need quite a lot of funding to do this stuff, and you're handling things that are extremely old. And it's just that nobody's doing it more than anything. He doesn't really have a good reason as to why it hasn't happened yet. All he says is everyone must do it. Please go do it. I've done it for here. You must do it for there. There's all this text out there. Please go and find it. And so that's exciting, right? Because it just goes to show, like, it's not that things aren't there. It's just being hidden from us. And that's the sophistry a lot of the time as well. Like, that's the spin up, how it works on people. Like, we think these empires are dead or like forgotten and gone. They're actually not. And he's also talking about the architecture as well. It's like, if people would just, like, he's like, if even 10% of the money that they spent on archaeology in Greece was spent on Africa, we would have found cyclopean structures all across Zimbabwe. We would have found like prehistoric structures, like dating, you know, hundreds of thousands of years, maybe even millions. It's just no one's doing it, right? So that's the thing. There's probably not even, you know, there's not even roads to get to it. So in a lot of these countries. Next slide. So, oh, sorry, no, yeah, because you're on the other side. Yeah, so the slide before was the ruins of Ghana. So I believe it appears to me from the pictures that I found that the tower I was telling you about, the one picture on the left there, that is whatever's left of it. That was the king's residence in the Empire of Ghana. And this city here is called Kumbi Saleh, and was the capital of that empire for over 1,000 years. And as you can see from the architecture there, they're using stone. By the way, most of those stone structures, they don't have any binding material. They sit one on top of the other like that. And they've been like that for 2,000 years almost. And there's also structures in Zimbabwe that are in the book, but I can't get into it today because it's just too much. But there's also many structures in Zimbabwe which are done in the same style. Also, they don't have concrete binding. There's no binding. And some of the walls are going 80 meters high. It's really impressive. Next slide. I showed this one already, so we've done that. Next slide. So this is Askia Muhammad the Great, the philosopher king of the empire, the Songhai Empire, the finality of the three empires, the cohesion of all three. He was the third king to rule the Songhai Empire, lucky number 3, after he deposed the king Sani Baru, the tyrannical son of that great king, Sani Ali. His reign was from 1493 to 1528, so a decent reign. Something also that I've noticed generally in reigns, life expectancy is a pretty good factor to figure out how good someone's character is. Normally, if they're healthy, and they reign a long time, they're generally good kings. I've noticed that in my historical studies generally. Not always. I mean, yeah. He follows in the footsteps of the first great Askia. I mean, actually, sorry, just to draw further on that, it is actually a point in Africa because kings are quite easily deposed in Africa if they don't behave correctly. So like I said, there's plenty of bad emperors, or Askias is the correct term. Plenty of bad ones. There's one called Askia Muhammad Ishak. He's a bad one. He's awful. He's the one that comes after this, Muhammad the Great. And he says when people come for gifts, he says the leader who gave gifts is basically dead in the ground, and those gifts are dead in the ground with him. So that's what he says to his people when they come asking for gifts at the gate of his residence. That's the king Muhammad Ishak who comes after this Askia Muhammad. Most of the Askias take the name Muhammad for the obvious reason of the faith. So he follows in the footsteps of the first great Askia, Sani Ali, as his military general. As a devout Muslim, this is his main reason in deposing Sani Baru. We already went over this. But also for his incompetence. The son of that king, like I said, was not well behaved. Then through the teachings of the Quran, Askia Muhammad would not only conquer lands, but also provide his people with wealth in gold form, food, and land to farm was even given to slaves. According to Sheikh, he is one of the most moral and generous kings the region ever had. Hence why he, as well as Mansa Musa, who was the emperor of Mali, this emperor was also known across the entire continent, and he is Ibn Battuta speaks most of this king. So Ibn Battuta is traversing the entire empire at this time. I'm going to read some of his texts in a bit. Next slide. This next slide will give you an idea of the warriors that the Songhai Empire had. So on the right, we have what would be the equivalent of a chevalier and a knight of sorts with the spear. So they didn't have firearms in Africa, which is even more testament to their fighting prowess and their courage, because especially later on, and of course, as the firepower of Europeans gets stronger, that's where the whole period of colonialism and slavery becomes quite barbaric, and it starts to go, it's not a business transaction anymore. Whereas in origin, as Sheikh said before, it was. So in the next slide, which is the last slide before I'm going to read some text, is the completed version of what I did earlier. And the one on the left that was missing is the ancient ruins of Ouagadougou, which was the former capital of the Malian Empire. And so in Ghana, you have the capital as Kumbi Saleh, that's on the right there. Then the next empire, Mali, top left, that's the capital there. These still exist today. People can go see them. It's not old pictures. And then in the bottom left and the top right, that's the Great Mosque of Djenné, which is the Songhai Empire. So in those 4 pictures, you have all 3 empires. And I think we can also see the gradual, architectural standards generally get a bit better. I mean, we're using different like resources and stuff, but they have stone in the south, whereas in the north, they're using more mud and clay. So yeah, there's some things that we can see architecturally. So that's the end of the presentation. Now I'm going to read some interesting texts. And first, I'm going to focus on Ibn Battuta. We haven't got too much longer. So I'm just going to go through some of the things that he says about these different cities. Here is an excerpt called Life at Walata. Walata was a city on the northern, towards the northern frontier of, it's not frontier, it's an oasis city at the bottom in the Sahel region. And at the time, it was the northern part of the Malian Empire. So here's what Ibn Battuta wrote. My stay at Iwalatan lasted about 50 days. And I was shown honor and entertained by its inhabitants. It is an excessively hot place and boasts a few small date palms, in a shade of which they sow watermelons. Its water comes from underground waterbeds at that point, and there is plenty of mutton to be had. The garments of its inhabitants, most of whom belong to the Masufa tribe, are of fine Egyptian fabrics, cotton and silk. Their women are of surpassing beauty and are shown more respect than the men. The state of affairs amongst these people is indeed extraordinary. Their men show no signs of jealousy whatever. No one claims descent from his father, but on the contrary, from his mother's brother. A person's heirs are his sister's sons, not his own sons. This is a thing which I have seen nowhere in the world except among the Indians of Malabar. But those are heathens. These people are Muslims. Punctilious in observing the hours of prayer, studying books of law, and memorizing the Quran by heart. Yet their women show no bashfulness before men and do not veil themselves, though they are assiduous in attending the prayers. And any man who wishes to marry one of them may do so, but they do not travel with their husbands, and even if one desired to do so, her family would not allow her to go. The women there have friends and companions amongst the men outside their own families, and the men in the same way have companions amongst the women of other families. A man may go into his house and find his wife entertaining her companion, but he takes no objection to it. One day at Iwalatan, I went into the Gadi's house after asking his permission to enter and found him with a young woman of remarkable beauty. When I saw her, I was shocked and turned to go out, but she laughed at me. Instead of being overcome by shame, the Cadi said to me, "Why are you going out? She is my companion." I was amazed at their conduct, for he was a theologian and a pilgrim to Mecca to boot. I was told that he had asked the Sultan's permission to make the pilgrimage that year with his companion. Whether this one or not, I cannot say, but the Sultan would not grant it. So that gives us I took that specifically for women. I really wanted to show, because like we could go into this with more rigor, but like I said, it's not time. So like I've taken these texts. It's a huge thing. I found it. I can again leave the link in the thing, but I've had to just contract it. And it's said that Ibn Battuta traveled around 75,000 kilometers in his lifetime. Now that far exceeds any other traveler that we know, like Marco Polo and any of those who even traveled by sea have not done that amount. That's almost twice around the earth. I don't know how much of that is myth, but if we look at actually his travels and you read this, you'll get a gist. He's going all the way to Genghis Khan in Mongolia and coming back to the Turks in the Black Sea, and then going to Spain, and then going to Morocco, and then going to Black Africa, Sub-Saharan, going to Timbuktu, and then back across to Egypt. Like, it's mad. Like, it's an incredible journey. But it's just great to get first-hand information of how women are treated, how the customs are. This idea of a companion, he puts it in quotation. I guess it means like a lover. And he mentions the thing of the men show no signs of jealousy whatever. So I think it's like they have marriage, but then they also have lovers, and there doesn't seem to be this idea of possession around things, maybe. And that's also stated in the book economically as well. People don't possess land. The kings don't own the land. That's something really distinctive between European feudalism, because like kingdoms in Europe, like in England, were made up of dukedoms, where the land was owned by the duke, and then the serfdom, like class, served that duke, and in return received enough to live, right? So it's just like really, yeah, very barbaric system. Whereas here, it's completely different. It's much like women have this equality, and also like the kings, like they don't own any of the land. So all of these empires, the kings don't own the empire. It's not like they own the land that they are living on. The people actually own it, and they have to pay a tax, and there's levies and there's customs and things like this, but it's all very fair. For example, I can't remember the space of land, but for like an acre of land that the king would farm with his slaves, like 1/10 of it he would give to his slaves to farm for their own benefit. So this was like, and that's not a sensual choice, that's systematic. Every king had to do that. There's these forms in the custom about possession which are very different to Europeans. So I think that even bends over into their family life. The way they consider wives and stuff like this, it's less possessive and more of a spiritual sense, and for the sake of family and to procreation. But when it comes to their sensual needs or whatever, it seems to be very liberal without sacrificing morality as well. It's not that he's saying that this is like perverted, or he's giving a very clean image of it. So it's just very interesting to see that how well women are treated as well. I think that's really something that people who are interested, if they want to read this book, it's something that you're going to see pop up a lot, and should not be surprised by it. And it's something still embodied in African culture today. Here's another extract. Ibn Battuta judges the character of the people of Mali. Quote, "The Negroes possess some admirable qualities. They are seldom unjust and have a greater abhorrence of injustice than any other people. Their sultan shows no mercy to anyone who is guilty of the least act of it. There is complete security in their country. Neither traveler nor inhabitant in it has anything to fear from robbers or men of violence. They do not confiscate the property of any white man who dies in their country, even if it be uncounted wealth. On the contrary, they give it into the charge of some trustworthy person among the whites until the rightful heir takes possession of it. They are careful to observe the hours of prayer and assiduous in attending them in congregations and bringing up their children to them." So again, I'll continue because we're losing time. Ibn Battuta arrives at Timbuktu. Here's his opinion of Timbuktu. Quote, "Thence we went on to Timbuktu, which stands 4 miles from the river Niger. Most of its inhabitants are of the Masufa tribe, wearers of the vase veil. Its governor is called Farba Musa. I was present with him one day when he had just appointed one of the Masufa to be Amir of a section. He assigned to him a robe, a turban, and trousers, all of them of dyed cloth, and bade him sit upon a shield, and the chiefs of his tribe raised him on their heads. In this town is the grave of the meritorious poet Abu Ishaq as-Sahili of Granada, who is known in his own land as As-at-Tuwayin. little saucepan is the translation. So there's a poet from Granada buried in Timbuktu. I just found that fascinating. It gives a first-hand example of, like, you know, not only are the foreigners living there, they're being buried there. They're actually being cremated or put to burial in whatever way they saw fit. So, and then they didn't confiscate their house and just take it back into their own hands. No, even if you were a foreigner, they would make sure that they handed it on to someone of your family or of your race, like basically the next common denominator, which again, I just find really just and fair. Here's a little bit on festival ceremonial. I was at Mali during the 2 festivals of the sacrifice and the fast breaking. On these days, the Sultan takes his seat on the Pempi after the mid-afternoon prayer. The armor bearers bringing magnificent arms, quivers of gold and silver, swords ornamented with gold and with golden scabbards, gold and silver lances and crystal maces. At his head stand 4 amirs driving off the flies, having in their hands silver ornaments resembling saddle stirrups. The commanders, cadi, and preachers sit in their usual places. The interpreter Duga comes with his 4 wives and his slave girls, who are about 100 in number. They are wearing beautiful robes, and on their heads they have gold and silver fillets, with gold and silver balls attached. A chair is placed for Duga to sit on. He plays on an instrument made of reeds with some small calabashes at its lower end, and chants a poem in praise of the Sultan, recalling his battles and deeds of valor. The women and girls sing along with him and play with bows. Accompanying them are about 30 youths wearing red woolen tunics and white skull caps. Each of them has his drum slung from his shoulder and beats it. Afterwards come his boy pupils, who play and turn wheels in the air like natives of the Sind. They show a marvelous nimbleness and agility in these exercises and play most cleverly with swords. So, yeah, I'm going to go on here. On feast days, after Duga has finished his display, the poets come in. Each of them is inside a figure resembling a thrush made of feathers and provided with a wooden head with a red beak to look like a thrush's head. They stand in front of the Sultan in this ridiculous makeup and recite their poems. I was told that their poetry is a kind of sermonizing in which they say to the Sultan, quote, "This Pempi which you occupy was that whereon sat this king, and that king and such were this one's noble actions, and such the others. So do you too do good deeds whose memory will outlive you." I guess they're kind of like setting him up to do goodness. Like it's kind of a insinuating thing happening. After that, the chief of the poets mounts the steps of the Pempi and lays his head on the Sultan's lap, then climbs to the top of the Pempi and lays his head first on the Sultan's right shoulder and then on his left, speaking all the while in their tongue, and finally he comes down again. I was told that this practice is a very old custom amongst them prior to the introduction of Islam, and they have kept it up regardless of the religion. So again, it's really interesting how they're able to keep their traditional values and customs in place while taking on the theology and of Islam. On another city, on Gorgor, quote, "I went on to Gogo, which is a large city on the Niger and one of the finest towns in the Negro lands. It is also one of their biggest and best provisioned towns, with rice in plenty, milk and fish, and there is a species of cucumber there called inani, which has no equal. The buying and selling of its inhabitants is done with cowrie shells, and the same is the case at Mali. I stayed there about a month and then set out in the direction of Tagada by land with a large caravan of merchants from Kadamas." So that's the end of my texts on that's the end of my kind of, the quotes that I took from Ibn Battuta. But yeah, I hope everyone got a very descriptive image in their mind of, how society is there. Very, very kind people, very welcoming, very, but also very just. The way economics is done, like there's a lot of form. The way that the rituals are done, there's a lot of form. Things are very detailed. There's a lot of beauty in this. There's a lot of distinction, and I think that is something that could not be achieved without, you know, these empires which are ruled by these kings that are just capable of taking out actions for the greater good, and really making these cities that are gonna hopefully one day bring about a renaissance in Africa of sorts, that you know, modern people can use to stand on again, and fill in the gaps. Because like I said, like there are a lot of gaps even in Sheikh's work, and he admits it and he tells you where they are. He's completely humble in that mission, and he's asking everybody to keep doing the same, because it is out there. It's just nobody's spending the money on it. I also wanted to, before we finish, to just mention something. It's another part of the text from Sheikh's book that I took, and it's on the issue of slavery. It's kind of hard to talk about all these things in the same class, because it's just like it's conflicting. But this is a quote from the book. It has been estimated that the slave trade swallowed up 100 million to 300 million individuals, dead or shipped to America. So, had it not been for slavery, the total figure of Black population on the continent would probably have been 4 times what it now is. It would have been in the vicinity of 400 million. Cheikh Anta Diop. So, I think when he wrote that, it was like 1960, and the population of sub-Saharan Africa at the time was around 240 million. When I say sub-Saharan, I mean Black, everything below the Tropic of Cancer. And those are not my terms, those are Sheikh's terms, so I use his terms. And he's claiming that before the period of slave trade started, there are around 400 million Africans living in the Empire of Songhai, right? And that's at its peak, which is basically 1460 to 1550. So at the time of writing this book, the population of sub-Saharan Africa was 220 million. A loss of 180 million people still. So between 1550 and 1960, still had not made up for that loss of population. And people keep on talking about how Africa's overpopulated, and I just don't get it, right? Now it's crazy. And he states in the book, like he says, quote, "It's a Malthusian policy." It's basically, he's calling it bullshit. He's like, you know, it's completely unheralded. Like it's baseless, because not only you took 3/4 of our population and plunged them into degeneration in the Americas and Europe. At least the slaves in Africa, you know, they were literate, they were educated, they had land, they had skills, they had gold, even. But not in Europe, not in America. No, the Black slave in Europe and America has a far different reality. No gold, no Persian silk around his shoulders. No, just hard labor. So, and a good old whip and everything else that came with it. So if we compare, at the time, Europe, by comparison, is estimated to, I've looked at these numbers and they're not too clear, but around 90 million. So in the same time, the Songhai Empire, which is not the whole of Africa, it's just the West African part, has 400 million people. And as a maximum, anywhere between 300 and 400. And Europe has only 90. Again, we see the you know, the natural wealth of Africa allows for a greater expansion of population in a quicker amount of time, given the climate is warm. They have a lot of food growing out of the ground, whether you like it or not. I've been to Kenya and Tanzania. Really, you can just be in a swimming pool and you'll see an avocado tree bending over the wall. You can't keep things from growing there. So that's a given. But the way the treatment of the slaves is something to be is something very distinct and very different. Not many similarities there. And I just like to tie that in with, I mean, that's probably, I mean, given if we look at the Songhai Empire and its wealth and prosperity and the customs there and all the resources that they're using, probably the reason why, you know, one of the reasons why they've never, you know, really gotten their economy back on track is the loss of all of that manpower. You know, Lyndon LaRouche made the very, you know, necessary discovery of population flux density as a denominator of value, and that if you don't have people, then you have no value, because the real essence of value, where value really exists, is in the human mind, is what the human mind gives value to. And so if you lose 3/4 of your people who are all capable of metaphysics and all capable of imagining creatively reasonable things, well, it doesn't leave you in the best economic situation, does it? Leaves you with, you know, half a leg, half an arm, and, you know, one eye. Like, you basically, and bear in mind that the people that would have been taken are largely men. See, because always people think of economy as numbers, right? They never think of it as like the human mind is actually what economy is. And so it's not a number. The number is the utility to describe economics. But if you lose 300 million men, women and children, they are your past, your present, and your future. Well, then your economy, right? Inventors, artists. I wanted to show you guys another picture, because my internet's so rubbish, I couldn't. But I was going to show you some photos of classical art from Benin that sits in French museums. And first of all, the first thing is the similarities to Egyptian sculptures. Okay, so like incredibly similar. I mean, pretty much the same. Like they have of the same quality. There's a humanist content to it, which is like of equal caliber. Yeah, I just didn't get a chance to show it, but it's out there. If you go on Google Images and just put in like Benin classical sculptures, you'll find like loads. There's like, you know, right now they're actually trying to get these things back into Benin to put into museums. I know Egypt right now has just built a brand new museum in Cairo to start bringing a lot of the African artifacts back to Africa. But I found that thing about slavery incredibly interesting, because it does tie in with what Lyndon LaRouche discovered. And we can ascertain that, like, well, given that the population never, until today, hasn't, you know, even in 1960, when Sheikh was writing this book, you know, Black Africans amounted at around 240 million people. It's still half of what they originally had just in the Songhai Empire, just in one empire of Africa. So it's really quite drastic. And so what slavery really did, more than anything, more than a race issue, more than all the cultural elements that they bring up today, which is the sophistry, it's economics. It's the real foundation. Like, the real problematic thing in it is that we stole not just resources, the people that could have been capable of utilizing those resources. That's the point. We took the minds, we took the brains off the continent that could have been, especially with that culture, they could have been the creators, the discoverers, you know, like that king who went out to the ship, like to the sea. And as we see in their architecture, like that could have continued, but the period of colonialism and slavery basically put an end to it. And it's not that, you know, the Africans did in origin take part in the business transaction. They do have a certain amount of responsibility. They did sell black slaves to Europeans. It's not up for discussion. It's been recorded. There are receipts, recorded receipts of the transaction taking place. Also, when an empire has 200,000 warriors, it's pretty, you know, unreasonable to think that someone could conquer this. So instead of at the time conquering it, no, they just, you know, the merchants from Europe would go across, do the business. Slaves were sold just like they were sold on the continent already between tribes. And it's got nothing to do with the color of people's skin. It's all economics, actually. So finally, it's 9:10. I just wanted to say something about that nautical experience that king had to finish us off. I think it's enough for today. So it is clear from the preceding that the navigable watercourses of Africa were studded with wharfs and landing docks, which were at one and the same time commercial ports, and when necessary, military ones. The largest craft, that were called canter, could carry a crew of up to 80 men. On the Niger, in place of the inverted sails characteristic of Black Africa, the boats were covered by a mat that formed a kind of roofing against the elements. The Askia alone owned over 1,000 pirogues. Pirogues are the long boat that they used to use in Egypt, where they'd have the mat on top to provide shading, and the pharaohs and their families would often take like leisure trips down the River Nile on them. I'm sure people have seen these boats before. They have the exact same boat in West Africa. Again, another striking similarity. Yeah. On the Niger, in place of the inverted sails characteristic of Black Africa, the boats were covered by a mat that formed a kind of roofing against the elements. Oh yeah, the Askia alone owned over 1,000 pirogues. Each of his daughters had one for transportation or pleasure cruises on the river, just as the pharaoh's daughters had on the Nile. The question has often been asked whether the Africans ever left the continent by sea, whether to the west, the Atlantic Ocean had allowed them, before the arrival of Europeans, to establish relations with any other country. Considering the enormous obstacles to overcome, all rivers have a bar, specialists have tended to answer in the negative. This is the point of view of Professor Theodore Monod. Yet it seems that the Arabic documents allow us to shed some light on the matter. Muhammad Hamidullah, quoting Ibn Fadala al-Umari, shows that the emperor of Mali, Kankan Musa, like Mansa Musa's predecessor, made 2 attempts at exploring the Atlantic. In the first, he equipped 200 ships for a 2-year stay at sea. Only one of the captains was able to return with his vessel. The recital of the catastrophe he gave the king, instead of discouraging him, prompted him to undertake a second expedition. He is then said to have equipped 2,000 ships, turned his throne over to Sultan Musa, and embarked with the fleet himself. This time, nobody returned. The author of this study puts forward several arguments to demonstrate that this fleet, or perhaps another earlier one, must surely have reached America before Columbus. In the first place, not only did Columbus's crew say they had found blacks already there before them, but they even gave details of their lives. They stressed that the blacks often fought with the redskin, Indians. The same author reminds us, quote, Christopher Columbus speaks of pirogues allegedly leaving from the coast of Guinea, laden with merchandise and heading west. He also recounts the arrival of such vessels in the Americas. Jane, the translator of the Journal of Columbus's third voyage, writes, quote, and that he considered checking the veracity of what the Indians of Hispaniola, Haiti, had said they had come to their island from the south, while the blacks had come from the southeast, and that they had javelins with tips made of a metal they called guanin. The pirogues actually seen by Christopher Columbus prove that the bars of the rivers had been crossed, that there were indeed pre-colonial maritime ports, and that the Atlantic was no wall to the blacks of West Africa. The author of the article goes further and attempts to establish that relations between Africa and pre-Columbian America were relatively constant. Quote, such navigators taking to sea again from the Americas for the return voyage to Africa, would have loaded provisions of New World origin. And of these items, the 2 that would keep the longest were sweet corn and tapioca. We thus have now an explanation of the presence in Africa of 2 American foodstuffs before Columbus had ever made a voyage there. End quote. So that's the end of my class today. I just wanted to make, I think that is the directly from Sheikh's book. And, again, is a classic example of the wealth and, expertise and strength and power of these empires, and the capacity they had to not just conquest, but also take care of their own people, given the relative peace that existed over 1,500 years before it was disturbed by Europe. It's certainly food for thought. And I think for a lot of Western people today, basically we're illiterate on the subject of Africa. I always found that I was. It's one of the principal reasons when I was younger, having my parents live there, I decided I needed to do the work. I think if we can, you know, and what Sheikh goes on in this book to say, like, you know, racism and all these things, all these social effects of the cause are basically, they're just distorted. Like, and he says they're non-interesting. He really focuses on economics because he's like, you know, like, because he talks about the role of sovereignty, and he's like, well, you can't be sovereign unless you have your mind. Like, your people have to know their mind. They have to know what their culture is. They can't, we can't westernize Africa. And he says this specifically, like, he's like, there can be no policy of westernization on the African continent. He's like, to do that is the worst form of enslavement that could ever happen. He's like, you're stripping the people of their origin. And he's like, and it just simply won't work. He's not even, you know, he's not even contesting it. So it's his mission in life. And we see from these books to not just research the past, but reimagine it for the future, and try and reform whatever was lost and whatever was burned and destroyed by colonialism, to, instead of turning it into a race issue, which basically diminishes the true value of this education. He never mentions race. He's like, really, it's all about people being allowed to express their culture for what it really is, and not having it be bastardized or stripped away from them. And so he says Africa will not realize its full potential until the pre-colonial history of it is firmly embedded in the conscience of people's minds, and that they cannot, you know, before we have, you know, prosperity, money, all these things, economics, whatever, before we can actually do those things correctly, we have to have a national consciousness that upholds like the pride of these nations. And that, because some of these nations, like if you go there, they consider white people like gods. Huh? They really consider themselves backward. And it's a bit of a distortion, because you're like, well, you're not. You just haven't been taught what happened. They're taught British empirical history, right? They're taught about the First and Second World War in Kenya. I'm working with a team in Kenya right now. They're working on Second World War history. I mean, what has that got to do with their life? Nothing. It's not important. Like, it's important for them, but it's not of sole importance. It's not like, I mean, Africa played a colonial role in the World War, but not by choice, by force. So it's not real history for them. It's their history is pre-1550, and from what I'm finding, no one seems to know about it. So that's a problem, because what I'm seeing now in Kenya and places is like with music and art, it's all becoming westernized, right? You've got CNN out there and BBC, like, you know, dumbing down people's brains, and then you've got MTV and the BET awards and all of this rubbish, and then they start doing like Afro dance and Afro music, and they try and create like an African Western culture, like a pseudo culture. It's not going to work. It's completely false, and anybody can see it who has a brain for a second. But it's dangerous. It's really dangerous. And if we don't tackle this, if we don't get people re-educated on this stuff, I don't think we're going to see an end to the enormous amount of problems that exist on the continent. And so, yeah, that would be my final word. That I think it's just as much for Africans as it is for everyone else. It's important that we reconfigure cultural, equality of some sort, because what I find a lot with my culture is that we often assume that we are the greatest of all cultures. And I think it's more just because we don't really learn about others. So I think if the West could really do anything right now, it's probably look outside a little bit more and take the humble road, and maybe we'll be more beautiful that way again. And yeah, thank you everybody today for listening. I hope I didn't bore anyone too much.
Nick, I have a question.
Sure, go. Hit me up.
Okay. So you were mentioning that your friends or your study group, they are
Yep.
studying World War II, World War One, World War II.
Yeah, they were. Yeah.
Why? Why? Who made them do that?
That's the universities. That's Kenya, and like it's in Tanzania as well. Dar es Salaam University. All of
That's their curriculum.
Yeah, their curriculum's completely British.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah. They don't even learn really. Like they don't learn what Kenyan history. I asked them. I'm like, what have you learned about Kenyan history? They're like, what's Kenyan history? So like colonization is not over. That's basically what I'm saying. Because it can't be over until you defeat it in the mind. That's where power lies. That's where action lies. It's a metaphysics. It's not outside of ourselves. So until we reform the consciousness, like Sheikh says, it's just going to remain the same. You can change the numbers, you can change the form, you can change whatever you want. The content has to change. The way they think of themselves has to change. And the way we think of them has to change. And everybody else too. And each culture in relation to one another, just not just those two, but each culture has to, find a relation again and use that relation to bring this world to a higher, standard of civilization. It's perfectly possible. It's been shown in history before. We've done it. We just need to cement it. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Nick.
Nick, I have a question.
Oh, yeah. I just want to say one little thing here. We have time for about, let's say, 15, 20 minutes of questions before we have to have a conference call with something. So let's do some speed questions in a sense, or speed question answers. And
I'll do speed answers.
Take a little bit of time to pitch your next idea, Nick, at some point for part 2 of your class.
Sure.
You can do that now, or you can do it after the question that's about to come up.
Question first.
Question first.
Who's first?
You.
Okay. Nick, tell us about Sheikh, where he is now, and how old is he?
Sheikh's not with us anymore.
Oh, he's not. You
No.
were speaking as if he's still alive.
Yeah, it's just because all the information is so fresh in me. I read this book twice, and I've been basically nonstop Sheikh for like the past 4 weeks, and
so he's alive for you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, like I'm sure you've had that where you've read an author and you're like,
yeah,
you almost feel like you're talking with them.
And when did
then, of
he
course,
die?
Yeah, I'll get the exact date for you.
I think it's 1986.
86. Okay.
Or 87.
62.
62 he died? No.
Yeah, he went to prison, remember, and they almost killed him in there. So, like I say, it was bad. What happened to him in Senegal was bad. It's really covered up. Like, there's really not much you can find on it. All I've heard.
1986.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, he probably wasn't the healthiest after that experience. Any other questions?
I think for that Renaissance, and I think it's beautiful if that whole knowledge of the culture before the 1500s, could be taught. But I think there has to be a spiritual Renaissance kind of happening at the same time, educational as well as the spiritual, because there's so much damage that has been done, so much brainwashing. I mean, we're the same here in Canada. Like, we didn't even know, we were basically under the British anyways. Like that, how do you turn that brainwashing around? I think that's spiritual. It has to be both. There has to be a real spiritual root. And just, what you were sharing about those philosopher kings, well, they had a deeply spiritual grounding. You couldn't, have that kind of culture without that.
No, they also had checks and balances on them. So, you know, it's also the advisors around them are also very, you know, diligent and just people. I couldn't go into that stuff. I mean, that's all I can say is just, you know, buy the book. And but it's so packed with information. You know, no 2-hour class could do it justice. It's impossible. The biggest thing, like the hardest thing for me to do is to contract this information. And actually it doesn't do it service because this topic is so badly taught. People are just gonna it's just really gonna have to get out there and read it and digest it and then reform it and then start teaching it out there because and that's why I do it, because I work with a team in Kenya. We're trying to build this arts academy, which I can go into another time with people, but you know, you're not going to build an arts academy without stuff like this. You're going to fail at the first hurdle. This is essential. Like it's not playground work. Like art and culture is historic. You know, Aristotle's been around 2,500 years, Plato as well. So like when things stand the test of that time, it's not, it's really serious work, and to do it well, like this is going to have to be digested and, you know, really well taught, and, you know, lectures and many conferences and Q&As, and start getting people. I mean, this is what Diop was doing. He was having lots of, you know, public occurrences with people where he was trying to, you know, get the information out there. And because he was so active, that's what was so dangerous about him. He was so quick and so quick to act on things and to take initiative. He was doing Q&As, he was setting up conferences, he was showing people his work, you know, people, of course, look at it like they're interested. Africans, of course, were interested by this. They were like, wow, oh my God, I feel proud. This is amazing. I've never felt proud before. Has anybody heard of Afro-pessimism? It's become like a cult thing of Africans who just basically are, you know, not so kind to themselves. And I've heard this thing, like this word, Afro-pessimism, popped around so many times, and it stems from this. It's the culture, but it's complete. It's been spun because it's all there. It's like what I'm fighting with this group now. When they read about it, like they're like, "Oh my God, like we're brilliant," and I'm like, "Yeah, you're brilliant. You're like everyone else. Like you're brilliant. Like you were brilliant, and you are. It's just a matter of timing. Like, are you ready to be brilliant? Like, do you want to take on the challenge that Sheikh set? Because there's really not many people like him in Africa that did this." And this is at the height of Pan-Africanism. I always find that funny too. Like, but I'm gonna have to keep researching and see if there were others like him who were trying to do this and see what we can gather. I start with a small group of 6 right now, and then they're gonna start teaching each a small group of 6 themselves, and we'll expand it that way. But yeah. Magda, do you have a question?
I wanted to say something again. You know, a lot of the leaders of the nations of Africa, they basically studied Oxford, you know, English universities, right? And yeah. The English, and that's exactly how the British are doing it. They educate these so-called leaders in the way that they want them to be. And they're becoming their puppets.
Like Idi Amin was brought up in a British military barracks, right?
There's uncountable many of these leaders who were studying in the United States or in Great Britain.
Yeah.
And that was the whole idea. Like George Washington University in Washington, D.C. is full of kids from leading families of these different countries, right?
Yeah.
And they're expecting to go back to their countries, and then they become the future leaders, and all they do is repeating the garbage that they have learned.
It's funny, right? Because that's not actually an African custom. That's a European custom.
Yeah.
Right? It's not. It never worked like that before. That's why I made that point earlier in the lesson. I couldn't attach it so much, but like it wasn't a family linear system. It's only today that it's become like that kind of corruption that you see, like that the families, the political families, like in South Africa and stuff, they basically Not all of them, and that's again the trouble, right? Like where it works so well, because they're able to distort the original history. They're able to also distort the battle going on today within the continent. Like if you consider that, like someone like Kwame Nkrumah in comparison to Julius Nyerere. Now, on the surface of things, they look like they're fighting for the same thing, right? But they're not. Julius Nyerere, I always find it hard to pronounce his name, but the first president of Tanzania, Nyerere, he was, you know, taught and trained in a Dar es Salaam University, a completely British education, and I mean, yeah, he's kind of like a communist in the end, but and that's also what they teach nowadays, right? Pan-Africanism, it's just communism reinvented, right? It's just like, yeah, that's it. British education, it's just communism. Now no one's going to look at it. But it's not actually in the Pan-African period where in the 60s when independence starts happening. Oh, you definitely do have two fights, like two battles going on one side, which is the Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, the Nasser Hussein, and who's the guy in Ethiopia? Anyways, Haile Selassie. So you have this faction, but then you also have like the Julius Nyerere and Idi Amin and these kind of people. He comes later, but it's of the same education. I haven't studied the bad ones so much because why would you? But yeah, there is a schism there, and it's easy to play on because some leaders are miseducated and other leaders have educated themselves. So Kwame Nkrumah was that kind of man. He was good friends with Paul Robeson. Matt can tell people a lot about that. He knows a lot on that. But Kwame Nkrumah was actually in Lincoln University in Pennsylvania for 8 years before and that's where he met Paul Robeson. They became great friends and started talking about these ideas of independence and sovereignty being regained in Africa. And that's probably why Ghana got its independence first, because Kwame was just such a brilliant strategist and really well-educated man and understood his roots. Was probably, I got to look at whether he had any connection with Sheikh. I can't imagine they didn't, but I just haven't seen it. So yeah.
I guess it depends on the depth of character of a person, right?
Yeah.
Are you easily morally corrupted, or you have more to yourself, to your center?
And the thing, I mean, Sheikh talks about it. I think it's in this one. So my second class, which I kind of decided today, I was going to try fit this book in, believe it or not. Nah, it's just impossible. This is like the future plan, super dense, but doesn't waste your time. Cheikh Anta Diop probably didn't have time to waste. This will be what the second class is on, like volume 2 will be on how we can, how the world or Africans can take this and run with it, and how they, like the economics in this is very much in line with Lyndon LaRouche and Hamilton and all of those guys, real political economy. And yeah, digest it as far as I can.
I have a question, Nick.
Yeah.
Did you in your research encounter anything on any relationship between Cheikh Anta Diop and W.E.B. Du Bois?
Didn't see anything.
No? Okay.
But he must be, right?
It absolutely must be, yeah.
I mean, it's like living in the same world at the same time. Like, no, it's not possible.
Yeah, and they're both friends with both Paul Robeson. Well, I don't know about, and what about Paul Robeson? Did you find any relationship there either?
I think there's something with Paul, because Paul went to Senegal.
Because they're two Renaissance men of a very high order, well, including W.E.B. Du Bois, who's another Renaissance man, and they're all networking in the same, spheres.
And they're all calling for the same United States of Africa concept, which people say is a Martin Garvey concept. I mean, that's up for debate. Again, he's of a different breed. He's not altogether bad, but yeah.
We just lost a bit of your audio.
Ah, sorry. It's probably because I took my earphones off.
So it's now 9:36. So I think that we're running out of time, unfortunately, for this evening. Did you want to have anything else to say, both as a parting thought or also maybe additionally for the upcoming class that we'll have to schedule for you?
No, it's late. You know, once I start talking, I don't stop, so I'll finish there.
You're a man of passion. No, I understand where it comes from. It's a good thing. It's a beautiful thing. Thank you so much, Nick. And
like brain bomb.
No, it is great. And despite the little turmoil and storm that we encountered on the technological level breakdown early on, you picked up and ran with it beautifully. It was a really great introduction. Looking forward to the next one that we'll schedule very soon. Also, Martin Seif wanted to do a follow-up to his class. So I think we could do something once the symposium is done. I think we have enough people who want to finish their thoughts or add another chapter to their ideas. So we'll do something soon, probably in September on part 2. If you could also include a bibliography, and that way we'll include the list of all of the great titles that you would recommend people go out and buy and read by Diop. We'll do that in the description box of this video. Sound good?
Yes.
Great. So everyone, thank you so much for coming tonight. Have a great week. And next week, we're going to jump into Cynthia Chung's class on the Bandung Conference and some of the dramatic fights of the 1950s Bandung Conference, and some personalities like Zhou Enlai and many others in India, Africa, and beyond. Followed by something by Pascal Chevrier, JFK, FDR, and some other anti-imperial fights that have been written out of history after that. So hope to see everyone next Sunday at 4 p.m.
Sweet. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.